France loves its mirrors more than its memories. It polishes the glass of Versailles until the past looks clean, until the rooms glow with orchestrated light, until the reflections behave. But there are faces the mirrors never catch. Faces that pass through the corridors like drafts. Faces the court trained itself not to see. If you stand still in the hall of mirrors long after the last visitor leaves, if you listen not to the chandeliers but to the silence between their crystals, you might hear the breath of a child the kingdom tucked away. Her name was Louise Marie Thérèse. She arrived wrapped in discretion, carried by hands that belonged to no one officially. The carriage that bore her had no need to announce itself. The escutcheon on its door spoke in place of voices. It rolled not to a palace but to a convent, whose gates had learned the grammar of secrets. The sisters of Moret did not ask questions they were not meant to have answers to. They opened the door and received a life. The crown would never claim, but would never abandon. No proclamation, no christening near a throne, no portrait with lace stiff as armor. Only a ledger entry sparse and careful. Only the rustle of habits and the soft repetitions of prayer. Only a child who, from her first hour, belonged to the blank spaces between sentences. She was not like the babies the sisters knew. Tutors followed her in. Books followed after the tutors. Linen finer than the convent. Had any right to possess arrived in chests that smelled of cedar and court. There were combs of silver, a rosary with pearls, a small crucifix unusually heavy for its size. More telling than the objects were the visitors. A physician whose face the abbess had seen before, at a distance on days when royal litters passed. A confessor who bowed to no one but God and one other man. She was not told whose child she was. She was told instead how to hold a spoon, how to hold herself, how to hold her tongue. The first she learned swiftly. The third she learned faster still. Some children are born into noise and must be taught quiet. She was born into quiet and understood at once that sound has a price. She learned to listen the way others learned to run. Naturally, joylessly, as if her body had always known. There were rumors long before there were facts. Because rumors do not require permission. They threaded through salons, curled under doors, fell from the mouths of courtiers, who had cultivated the art of innuendo until it bloomed in frost. They named the queen and then refused to say her name. They spoke of a difficult confinement. A stillbirth murmured and then retracted. A mourning that did not fit the garments it wore. They spoke of a cry heard in a room where silence had been legislated. And they spoke in lowered tones of skin that did not conform to portraits. Louise's complexion was a sentence before it was a self. The sisters of Moret called it blessed. The world, when it dared whisper, called it evidence. And for a court that staged sunlight, a child whose face made the sun look at itself differently was not an heirloom to display. She was a truth to hide. Nothing in France's long catechism prepared Versailles for a princess who contradicted the pictures. Nothing in its theater prepared it for a body that declared the monarchy's divinity a little less white than it preferred. So the city did what it does best. It lied with exquisite manners. The royal almoner found new densities of charity for Moret. The confessor's route acquired a detour. A seamstress who had once stitched cuffs for a queen began, mysteriously, to stitch veils for a nun she never met. A painter at court shaded a face just so and repainted it the next day before anyone noticed. Because someone had noticed. In an age when even the shadow of an eyebrow conveyed allegiance, the light around this girl was arranged with technical mastery. At 13, other noble girls learned to curtsy without bending. At 13, Louise learned to curtsy to a door that would not open. Her lessons surpassed her cell. Latin, history, music, gifts wrapped like precautions. She learned the names of kings whose portraits would never include hers. She learned the dates of battles, fought to defend the honor of a dynasty, that did not know how to honor her. The sisters taught her theology with a care they did not extend to anyone else at Moret. It is useful, after all, to offer women who cannot change their fate a philosophy that blesses the inability. Her voice when she used it was calm, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had been taught that words are water poured on marble in a house that refuses to stain. She said the prayers as if they mattered, and they did, but not in the way prayers matter to children who were born in sunlight. For her, faith became a ballast, heavy enough to keep the ship from flipping, when sudden winds came from the direction of Paris. At 13, letters are closed doors to other worlds. Hers were opened and read by hands that left no fingerprints. She received notes without signatures and sent gratitude into the void. The ink tasted of iron and discretion. It was like writing to the mirror and watching the mirror eat your words. France believed itself civilized because it knew where to put its scandals. You put them in salons with wittier phrases. You put them in dungeons with larger locks. Or, most refined of all, you put them in convents that felt like mercy. When a girl's existence embarrassed your myth, you wrapped the embarrassment in linen and called it vocation. You invited God to take the blame. You let years do the rest of the labor. Time is a faithful housemaid to empires that prefer dusting to confession. Louise's cloister was not a punishment. It was a plan. Her room did not lack for warmth. Her meals did not lack salt. Her lessons did not lack challenge. But her life lacked a horizon. A window offered a slice of forest and a generous square of sky. Beyond that square, wagons came and went. Seasons fulfilled their vows. Within, a calendar of feast days replaced birthdays. Novenas replaced dances. A ribbon of sunlight across. A stone floor replaced a promenade. With a mother who never came. The nuns were kind. The way rain is kind, it falls evenly. They were not cruel, the way frost is not cruel. It happens. They taught her to braid a life out of the thin strands, permitted to women who have more meaning than choices. They set the hours the way clocks set oceans, and she learned to swim in a sea that did not move. When they paused by her door, there was reverence in the pause. There was also distance. They were guardians of a secret they did not possess. Jailers without keys who believed, perhaps sincerely, that they were protecting her from the world and the world from her. Once, twice, thrice a year, a new figure would cross the threshold. A bishop with hands soft from absolving those who could afford to be absolved. A gentleman who did not sit because the chair offered to him was humbler than the chair he believed himself entitled to. A woman whose perfume refused to apologize for entering a convent. They smiled at Louise with sincerity practiced to perfection. They asked about her devotions, about her Latin, about her health. None of them asked the one question. That would have broken the room open. "Whose child are you?" She learned the ways people say everything but the truth. In the mirror, she practiced an expression that neither invited pity nor provoked fear. Mirrors were not her enemies. They were her co-conspirators. They taught her how the court would prefer to see her. If the court ever saw her at all, contained, graceful, uninterested in the world that had shown no interest in her except to hide her. This is how a child becomes a myth under her own skin. Not by grand events, but by the steady pressure of people who need you to be smaller than your edges. The court needed her to be a rumor. The church needed her to be a soul. She needed to be a person. The arithmetic did not balance. Arithmetic never balances when the equation includes a girl and an empire's reflection. They called her the Black Nun of Moret when they dared give her a name. The phrase traveled from carriage to carriage with the stubborn cling of a burr. It fed on ignorance and starved on specifics. Have you heard? They say, it is understood. Passive verbs. Like veils, do the work of hiding the hands that place them. The rumors did not decrease her solitude. They deepened it. Few desired to see the truth beneath the story. The story was too useful. It made respectable people feel daring, and daring people feel discreet. Louise grew in the way vines grow. When they are trained to a trellis they did not choose. She learned the chapel's acoustics and sent her voice into corners where it could be alone. She learned which hours of morning light felt closest to mercy. She learned that the crunch of gravel beneath. A coach was a conductor's baton that made every heart in the house hold its breath. She learned that sometimes protection and abandonment wear the same garment and differ only in the person who fastened the buttons. There were moments, small, radical, that belonged to her alone. A page of scripture that felt less like command and more like companionship. The first snow in a winter that would be harsh and beautiful, both, and in which she would walk with a thrill that startled her because it felt almost like joy. An afternoon when her tutor, old now, forgot his guard and told a story that made them both laugh. For once, like two human beings untethered by duty. She did not ask him to tell it again. Happiness opens doors in your chest that you must close quickly. When you live by grace on someone else's sufferance. Outside, Versailles performed itself. Masks, minuets, the mechanical fountain of the king's glance. The Sun King believed, not without reason, that light could be ordered. He was a genius of distance, arranging people and planets so that his radiance fell on them just so. But even a sun cannot illuminate everything. If it did, it would have to admit there were no shadows left to swallow the inconvenient, so he let the shadows do their work. He paid them with gold and absolutions. They kept the things he did not want to see from appearing in his sight line. If he knew her name, and how could he not? He spoke it into a box so deep the echo did not return. Maria Theresa, if she had reason to draw breath and pain in the same syllable, did so in a room that did not record such breaths. Queens, like saints in the paintings, are allowed tears as long as the varnish dries without cracking. A confession at dawn, perhaps. A donation by noon. A ride in the alleys of the gardens, where no one walked because nothing grew there but the plants that knew how to survive without witnesses. Louise was not permitted to marry. She was not given a ring to prove what everyone knew, that her body was no one's to claim and everyone's to regulate. She was not asked to take vows when she was 13. The church was patient where the court was frantic. It waited until 1920, until the world past her window had become a thing she watched, rather than yearned to touch. Then it asked gently if she would put a name to the life she had been living since, before she could speak a clear sentence. To keep faith with beginnings, she agreed. It is easier sometimes to consent to a fate that has consented to you first. The veil, when it came, felt less like loss than like recognition. Yet in the small private space where she placed her few permitted possessions, she kept one ribbon the color of court carpets. She folded it and did not pretend it was nothing. Memory is the only possession no institution has learned to regulate effectively. If they could have, they would have legislated memory, taxed it, assigned it confessors. She remembered enough to know that forgetting would be treason, not to a crown, but to herself. Visitors aged. Regimes shifted. Scandals bred new scandals like vines hopping walls. The gossip that had fed on her began feeding on others. A favorite fell. A financier rose. A treaty was signed with a flourish that obliterated the small lives it reconfigured. Her name traveled less frequently than seldom. This is how forgetting works at a national scale, not with a decree, but with a yawn. There were exceptions. A chronicler, meticulous and bored, recorded that Moret received a sum disproportionate to its size. He did not wonder aloud. Wise men who worked near power learned to leave their curiosity at the door, the way you leave umbrellas in an entryway. A parish priest wrote a note to himself about a woman whose bearing contradicted her veil. He underlined nothing lest the underline be read by a future unkind to underlines. An abbess, dying, murmured a name she had spoken in her head for decades, and died before. She could append the title she had never been allowed to say. Louise lived long enough to know that a life can be shaped by absences, more decisively than by presences. She watched girls, younger than she had been, enter Moret, with eyes still wide from the world. She watched some leave, bringing with them the orderly calm that convents breed, and the mild fury that confinement refines. She stayed. The world had not wanted her when it mattered. It would not know what to do with her now. Freedom is a skill you must practice in small ways before you can wield it in large ones. No one had taught her how. When she thought of youth, she did not think of forests or dances. She thought of instructions. Hold your voice this way. Hold your hands that way. Hold your curiosity in your mouth like a seed you will never plant. She walked the cloister with a stride that was her own kind of rebellion. Not fast, not slow, not meek. A walk that said, I am not a rumor. I am a person who has learned to inhabit a rumor so that it does not devour me. It would be easy to romanticize her, to make of her a sage of renunciation, to imagine that in exchanging a throne she never sat on for a cell, she could dust with her own hands. She discovered a holiness denied to those who twirl under chandeliers. Easy and false. She discovered, rather, a discipline so ferocious it seems, restful from the outside. The discipline of not breaking when you are bent each day by laws written for other bodies. The world past the gates turned its pages. Wars, births, funerals, treaties, new fashions, new words for old appetites, new appetites for old words. Louise learned to tell the weather by the taste of the air when the doors to the courtyard swung on their hinges. She learned to tell the decade by the number of gray hairs in the mirror that did not lie. She learned that some sufferings mellow with time like wine and others curdle like milk. Hers did both, depending on the day. On certain mornings, the world was light as the veil on her head. On others, it weighed like chainmail. She carried it either way. France had a revolution in it like a storm in a sky. Not yet, not in her youth, but the barometer was there if you knew how to read it. The court's dependence on spectacle grew more desperate. The poor's dependence on patience grew more thin. In the cracks between those dependencies, you could place a girl and say, the kingdom that does this to its daughters will do worse to itself. But Louise did not prophesy. She prayed. Prayer is not nothing. It is a way of keeping language alive when language has no power to change. The terms of your life. She prayed for people whose names she was not permitted to say. She prayed for a mother she could not claim and who could not claim her. She prayed for a father imagined as sunlight filtered through trees. She prayed occasionally for herself, and when she did, it embarrassed her. She had been raised to believe that other people's comfort was holier than her own truth. Holiness in Moret wore the face of endurance. She endured with grace because grace was the fabric available. It is wrong to say she had no choice. Everyone has choices in ounces. She chose her tone of voice, the turn of her head, when to look at the sky and when to look at the floor, when to save a scrap of bread for a sister who needed it more, and when to eat the whole crust because her hands trembled. Call this freedom if you want to. She did not. She called it living. There was a day when the convent bells tolled for her. Women who had measured their own days. By her footsteps reached for each other's hands. The abbess, new to the office, consulted a page that told her which prayers belonged to which deaths. None of the options said, a woman whose life was a royal margin. They used one that fits everyone because the church, like the state, prefers rituals that do not fray at the edges. No trumpets, no black plumes on horses, no lace handkerchiefs carefully wet and held at precisely the right angle. A grave in ground that had learned the names of many, women not famous enough to be forgotten properly. A cross that was a cross and not a symbol for anything except itself. Someone remembered to place flowers. Someone else remembered to write her name on a list that would be misplaced, then found, then burned by rain through a hole in the roof many years later. The kingdom did not pause. It rarely does for the lives that kept it from breaking open sooner. What remained of her moved the way stories move when they are too useful to die and too dangerous to be told straight. The Black Nun of Moret became a curiosity when it cost nothing to be curious. An age that congratulated itself on enlightenment poked at her memory with a stick. It debated whether she had even existed with the air of men weighing the moon. The debate, like so many elevated arguments, served to keep anyone from asking why. If she had existed, she had been required to vanish. In the rubble of archives and the spill of ink, fragments persist. A donation recorded in an unusually firm hand. A note about a visit no one would confirm. A description of a face that refuses to fade. From these you can build anything. A daughter of a queen. A mistake the court corrected with charity. A fiction that this very story perpetuates. People who need certainty will not find it in her. People who need truth might. The truth is simple and well-dressed. Power hides what embarrasses it, even when the embarrassment is only the proof of its own human blood. If you demand a name to attach to her parentage, you will miss her completely. If you demand a confession signed in a hand that shook once and then steadied, you will continue to look past the girl and into the mirror she was used to polish. Better to ask different questions. What kind of country makes a child into an omission? What kind of country teaches a child to accept it as grace? What does it cost to be the exception that proves someone else's rule? Louise paid with a life, not with spectacle, not with martyrdom, not with the kind of suffering that sells tickets. With days strung like beads, similar, humble, irreplaceable. With a childhood that ended before it had a chance to begin. Because stories told about adults can be tightened around a 13-year-old's throat. With a womanhood confined not by iron, but by the politeness of those who benefited from the lock. You may object to the phrase, sex-slave princess. You may say it cheapens her. You may say it inflames. You may be right. But what else do you call a girl bound by a lineage? She did not ask for to a system that used her body's meaning to stabilize its fictions. What else do you call a child whose autonomy was proscribed at the precise point where her existence revealed a truth about power's appetite? Princess is a word for inheritance. Slave is a word for negation. Put them together and you get the geometry of her life. A royal circumference drawn tightly around a void, where choice should have been. She was not forgotten because no one knew. She was forgotten because everyone did. Forgetting is a technique. It must be trained, practiced, refined. You do it in small omissions until you can perform it on the scale of a nation. You do it to daughters first, because their lives are easier to rename. You do it to the inconvenient because their existence risks contagion. She does not ask you to indict a dead king. She asks you, if anything, to look at the rooms you inhabit and notice what is missing from their portraits. She asks you to consider whom your era protects by erasing. She asks nothing at all. Because asking is a luxury she was not permitted and has not learned in death. It falls to you to ask in her name without stealing her voice, to remember without consuming, to refuse the cheap comfort of certainty. If you go to Moret on a day when the weather decides to forgive everyone, you might stand where she stood. You might hear the echo of bells that have been replaced by bells, and imagine the sound she knew. You might look at the strip of sky she adopted as a country, and recognize the color of the freedom she invented in small increments. You might say her name and feel it land in a place that has waited for it longer than you have been alive. France will not answer. Countries rarely apologize. They prefer commemorations. But sometimes the most honest monument is the refusal to repeat a mistake. If the nation cannot learn that from a war, perhaps it can learn it from a woman. If the court could not admit her, perhaps the century after can. A girl walked into a convent because the world could not bear to watch her walk into its rooms. She learned to be a woman there, not because the convent knew how to make women, but because she did. She learned to transform silence from a weapon, used against her, into a space she could fill with breath. She made of duty a language that did not betray her. She made of her life an argument for a tenderness, more dangerous than politics, the belief that every child deserves a name spoken out loud. Louise Marie Thérèse. Say it once and the mirrors tremble. Say it twice and the rooms remember their drafts. Say it again, until the kingdom that built itself on the illusion of perfect light admits that its shadows were filled with daughters who learned to live in the dark and somehow did not let the dark live in them. When the story ends, nothing ends. The walls stand. The chandeliers glitter. The music that taught courtiers how to breathe continues to teach tourists how to walk slowly. But the next time a guide pauses beneath a painting and tells you what is in it, ask what is not. Ask which face is missing. Ask whose life was wrapped in linen and called holy to spare a crown, the labor of humility. And if the guide does not know or pretends not to, leave a name behind like a coin for a ferryman. Louise.